If you were a kid in the 90s, your school library may have felt like a bit of a battleground when it came to scary books. After all, there were only a few copies of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books to go around, and every kid wanted to get their greedy hands on one. And that, my friends, is where Scary Stories for Sleepovers came into the picture. Do you remember these books? For some people, these covers will trigger a lot of nostalgic memories. I know it does for me, so tonight I want to discuss this strange little corner of 90s children's horror books and talk about why Scary Stories for Sleepovers might actually deserve to be known as something other than the other Scary Stories books. Alright, creeps, just a little forewarning before we get into things. I am going to be discussing select stories throughout this series that made an impact on me. Now, don't freak out. There are over 100 stories in this series, so I'm only going to be spoiling just a couple of those. It's a very small number, and also the illustrations themselves, if you're flipping through the books, those give away plenty of twist endings. Scary Stories for Sleepovers was a long-running horror anthology series that many readers still confuse with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. But despite the similar titles, these books were completely separate. Different publishers, different authors and illustrators, and a totally different approach to scary storytelling. While Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark focused on brief folk tales and urban legends, Scary Stories for Sleepovers featured longer tales of terror, starring ordinary 90s kids in peril, a bit more in style of the Goosebumps books, though these stories are a bit darker in tone compared to Goosebumps. Scary Stories for Sleepovers also appeared a whole year before the first Goosebumps book was published. It appeared in 1991 through Los Angeles publisher Price Stern Sloan, although I will say that the publishing history of these books does get a bit thorny at times. Depending on which volume in the series you pick up, some of them will say Price Stern Sloan on the back, others will say Lowell House. I've looked into this and yeah, it's a bit thorny, it's a bit confusing, so instead of digging into what small publisher was eaten by what larger publisher and so on and so forth, we're just going to keep it simple and talk about the books. Now, in 1991, Price Stern Sloan brought on author R.C. Welsh to pen the first book in the Scary Stories for Sleepovers series, alongside illustrator Ricardo Delgado, who brought the stories to life with his eerie, shadowy art style. While the artwork isn't quite as distinct or nightmarish as Stephen Gamble's artwork, these pictures still managed to capture my imagination as a kid and make me a little afraid to read the stories. But I was like 5 or 6 years old at the time, so that might have had something to do with it. I was just a little baby. Gosh, so many memories about these books. This is the one that I read the most time as a kid. This is my original childhood copy that I found at a yard sale, and I went on to read this so many times. A lot of these stories are lodged into my brain almost as deeply as Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This cover art especially just always really stuck with me. I always wondered what he is. This monster is not in the book. He's not in any of the stories, and that's the case with a lot of the Scary Stories for Sleepovers books, is that the monsters on the covers are not really featured in the books. They're really just original monsters just for the covers. Now, this series, as you can tell by the title, is meant for sleepovers. It's meant to be read aloud at a sleepover while you're in your sleeping bags, maybe next to the TV set while a scary movie plays. But I will say, this book is not as good for reading aloud as, say, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, those are very small little stories. They're very short. They're very to the point. They're very easy to read aloud and then pass on to your friends. Whereas the stories in these books are freaking long. They're many, many pages long. As a kid, I would bring these books along to sleepovers, and then I would always end up just reading Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark because I was like, I don't want to read this aloud. But these stories were really great for just reading by yourself. Say it's late at night, it's storming outside, you're about to go to bed, and you crack into one of these beneath the covers with a flashlight. It's perfect reading for that. Another memory I have about this is that when I would go to the library, they had an audio cassette recording of some of the stories in this book. I was always checking out that cassette tape. I would pop it into my tiny little Fisher-Price cassette player, and I would turn it on and I would follow along and read the stories along with the tape. And that's, I think, kind of what helped teach me to be a reader from a young age. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of that tape. I wish I did. It would be really great to own one. They also did an audiobook copy just like that for the fourth book in the series, which I'm going to talk about later. So this book in particular focuses mostly on completely innocent, well-meaning children who accidentally get themselves stuck in scary situations. And these scary situations ultimately lead to their demise. Now, sometimes the deaths happen off screen. Other times it is described in vivid detail on the page, like the 9th story in the book, for instance. Story number 9 is called The Girl of Their Dreams, and there is a child protagonist who has their throat ripped out by a vampire. The image of this child's bleeding throat is described in pretty gruesome detail, which left me totally shocked as a kid, but equally as shocked as an adult. I'd kind of forgotten just how vivid it was. But the story in this book that freaks me out even more is called The Gift. It's about this bratty little kid who gets the gift of an ant farm for his birthday. He thinks this ant farm is so lame, and he immediately begins to torture the ants in very cruel ways. That is, until, spoiler alert, he's asleep in bed one night, and then he wakes up because he's feeling itchy, like his skin is burning. He wakes up to find that he is completely covered in ants from head to toe. They're getting in his ears and in his eyes. They're filling his mouth, and he's trying to cry for his parents, but he can't. All he can do is lay there as these ants eat him alive and take their revenge. Now, The Gift is one of the few stories in the book that is about naughty children getting their comeuppance. But this trope would become a mainstay throughout the series, especially with the introduction of book number 2, which is called More Scary Stories for Sleepovers. This volume is penned by Q.L. Pearce, who would go on to write books 2 through 6 in the series. Before then, Pearce made a career in writing educational books for children, books about science experiments and nature. So this was a step in a new direction for her, but one that would establish her as a very important voice in 90s kids horror. Not all, but most of Q.L. Pearce's stories play out like cautionary tales for kids, very much in style of E.C.'s Tales from the Crypt. You've got stories about bullies and pranksters and greedy little kids stumbling into genuinely horrifying situations. And interestingly enough, Q.L. Pearce's books themselves seem fully aware of these influences. Throughout the series, characters are constantly shown reading horror comics and collecting spooky magazines. It's kind of like Q.L. Pearce is quietly acknowledging her pulpy inspirations. My personal favorite story in the book is The Lesson, which is the final story. This is about a young girl who has absolutely had it with her older brother. Her older brother is always scaring her and playing cruel pranks on her, and she hates him. She wishes he was dead. So one evening, after a particularly grueling day of being tortured by her brother, she makes a wish that she could get back at him. And then this creepy-ass monster appears at her window. He looks like one of the rock monsters from the Never-Ending Story, but absolutely evil. And he's like, I can get back at your brother. You just have to open the window and let me in. And she's like, maybe not. And he's like, no, you do want to let me in. And she's like, yeah, you're right, I do. So she opens the window. He immediately reaches in, grabs her, pulls her out into the darkness. And she's kicking and screaming. She's like, you promised me you would get back at my brother. And he's like, I will. After I'm done eating you, I will go inside and I'll eat your brother and I'll eat the rest of the people in your family and have myself a nice snack. Well, my dear, my price is quite high and it is time to pay up. The last sound Jessie heard was that of the vile monster licking its lips. Such a great story to end the book on. While some of the stories in Pearce's books get a little bit gory, she seems more focused on tightly crafted horror stories where the actions of the children decide their fate, usually off screen. For instance, in the first story in this book, it's called Night of the Keyquan, you have this character whose mother is an anthropologist and she's away studying different Native American people, but she's always sending him packages in the mail full of notebooks of scary stories that she's collecting collected throughout her travels. Her son Matthew then takes these stories that she's written down and brings them to his meeting at the Terror Society, which is basically just the Midnight Society from Are You Afraid of the Dark? The most recent story that Matthew has received from his mother is The Legend of the Kikwan, which is this Native American legend about this werewolf kind of creature that can come out of the woods if you summon it with a spell. It's kind of terrifying. I don't know why you would want to do that, but Matthew and his friends are a little curious to try it, but maybe just a little bit weary, a little bit scared. So instead they flip through the notebook and they decide to start somewhere a little small, maybe something a little less intimidating. They decide to try a rain spell to see if they can make it start raining. So they do, and it doesn't work. Nothing happens. They wait for like 5 or 10 minutes, no rain comes, so they're like, what the heck, let's try to summon the Kikwan. And they see while flipping through the notebook that the Kikwan are repelled by fire, and there's a giant fire in front of them, so they're safe. Even if it works, they're safe. Anyway, they try it, and it works. They see glowing red eyes in the darkness surrounding them. Phew, at least they have the fire to protect them. That is until the rain spell they did actually starts to take effect. It starts to rain, it puts out the fire, and those glowing red eyes start to advance toward the boys. So I guess they shouldn't have been treating Native American legends like child's play. That's kind of the warning of the story. Now, to prepare for this video, I read approximately 4 scary stories for Sleep-overs books, as well as a couple of the spin-offs, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. My goal was to read every last one of these books, but there are a ton of books in this series. There are 10 scary stories for Sleep-overs. There's 4 scary mysteries for Sleep-overs. There's scary stories from 1313 Wicked Way. There's a scary stories almanac. There's a ton of books in this series. And this video right here that you're watching right now will take me an entire week to edit. I couldn't get to all of these books. I'm only human. Yes, I read many of these as a kid, but that's been like 25 years. So I wanted to revisit all of these and refresh my memory, and I will over time. This is more of just what I read and a recap of what the series was. If you really want to know what's in all of these books, I recommend reading them yourselves. At least pick up the first 2 books. They're very strong. Now, book 3 and book 4, even more scary stories for Sleep-overs, are pretty good. There's quite a few standout stories throughout these, but I will say the more and more I read of these in a row, the more I began to feel like the stories were maybe a little bit tired. Like book 4, for instance, while it is pretty well written, I will say, the story concepts themselves just began to feel a bit stale. I would describe the stories as feeling maybe a bit forced, like maybe Q.L. Pearce was writing under immense pressure, which could very well be the case. I don't know if that's true. That's just me spitballing. So of the first 4 books that I read, I would say that this one was probably the weakest, though I will say it has some amazing artwork by Dwight Bean. I love his art style. It's super creepy and nightmarish. And like I said, there is actually an audiobook cassette of this as well that adapts maybe 4 or 5 of the stories in the book. You can actually find that on YouTube. So I will link that down below in the graveyard, and you can go give it a listen. It's a lot of fun, even if the stories aren't quite as good as the first couple books. So that was book number 4. Q.L. Pearce went on to write books number 5 and 6 in the series, starting with book number 7, Mega Scary Stories for Sleep-overs. Price Stern Sloan brought in author Don Wolfson to pen the stories in this book, but only one, because the rest were written by all different authors. Book number 8 in the series, which is simply called Scary Stories for Sleep-overs, number 8, was penned by Craig Strickland, and this is the final book in the series to have interior artwork. Book number 9, which is written by Alan B. Urey, and book number 10, written by Mark Kell, do not feature interior artwork. Goodbye to Dwight Bean's atmospheric, spooky artwork that haunted the imaginations of children for years. They went the cheap route and just presented the stories bare bones. Now, these final books in the series, especially book number 10, are super rare. Like, for many years, I didn't even think this book really existed. I had seen very low-res images of it online, and that was it. I thought maybe it was proposed and was canceled before publication. No, it was released. It's just very rare. While I haven't read that one, I have read the Scary Stories for Sleep-overs Almanac. The book is more of like a guide to hosting your very own scary sleepover. So you've got a bunch of true ghost stories that you can read to your friends. There's a section about haunted places. There's a section about different kinds of monsters and pulp culture. You've got a whole section called Planning Your Sinister Sleepover, where you can learn how to make your own scary sleepover invitations. You can learn to make scary decor for your sleepover with hideous hands. There are also recipes like tasty big toes and terrifying teeth. What cracks me up even more is this section called Sinister Sounds, where it's literally teaching you how to make your own scary soundscape for your party. It says to make ghostly moans, blow softly over the top of a soft drink bottle. For alien voices, turn on your TV, then hold your finger down on the channel clicker. The snippets of sound from the changing channels sound like garbled space creature speech. This is a good one. It's step number 5. After you've practiced for a while, put a blank tape in the cassette recorder and put on your first scary song. So it says that you can borrow a scary song soundtrack from your parents or your friends. If your song is also on cassette, you'll need 2 cassette players so you can record the sounds over the music. Or you could just go down the street to your local drugstore and buy one of the many scary sound cassette tapes that are on sale. Now, there are many other spin-offs throughout the series. There's Scary Stories from 1313 Wicked Way. This is by Craig Strickland, who was the writer on one of the other books. Now, I've not read this one, but I can describe what it is. This is basically just like Scary Stories for Sleepovers, but all of the stories in the book all take place in this one house. So the first story in the book takes place in 1798. It's called Prison Labor, and that is the earliest story to take place in this house. And you've got stories all the way up to the present day, which is the 90s. Hello. It's called Evil in the Ashes. So this haunted house has a very long and sordid history, and you can read all about it in this book. It actually sounds a lot like a book that I wrote an introduction for. It's called Doors of Darkness. Definitely go check it out. It's a really good book. It's got a similar kind of premise. There were also 3 Scary Stories for Sleepovers novels. I only have 2 because the third one is super rare. We've got The Living Ghost and Lost in Horror Valley, which is about dinosaurs for some reason. I never read these as a kid. I didn't even know they existed until pretty recently. I really wanted to read them for this video, but again, there's so many books in this series. It's literally endless. Hello, creeps, and welcome to the Mystery Room. We are in the Mystery Room because we're going to talk about the Scary Mysteries for Sleepovers. Scary Mysteries for Sleepovers is a spin-off, of course, of Scary Stories for Sleepovers. These are all written by Alan B. Urey, who did write one of the Scary Stories for Sleepovers books. Unlike the final Scary Stories for Sleepovers books, these do all have very nice illustrations, not quite as many. There's like an illustration every other story versus every story. What they tried to do differently with this series is, instead of just having them be spooky stories, they kind of work a mystery angle into the stories. Though I will say, it's the same. It's all the same. It's scary stories. There's a very slight little mystery angle to some of the stories, but really not all of them. And instead of being like monsters in the stories, it's usually like a serial killer or kidnapping or a ghost. There's still a lot of paranormal elements. Anyway, I only read this one, the first book. I haven't read these other ones yet. And I can say this is pretty good. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. Some of the stories were a bit forgettable, like the first 2 stories, for instance, I didn't think were very good. But then there were a couple of real knockout stories. For instance, Public Enemy is a really good one. It's about this kid who is watching this show called Public Enemy on TV. He sees that there is this slice and dice killer on the loose, and he is convinced that the guy who just moved in across the street is the slice and dice killer. So it turns into a little bit of like a Fright Night kind of situation where he's trying to prove to people that the guy across the street is a killer. The police are like, well, we already caught the slice and dice killer, so it's not him. And then the kid has to go across the street and apologize, and the guy invites the kid in. The kid sees all of these boxes in the house. He opens one of the boxes, and it's just a bunch of comic books. Here he thought there'd be like body parts in the boxes, and it's just comics. So he's going along, and he's looking in all the boxes and looking through all the cool comic books, and then he takes the lid off of another box, and there's a bunch of human bones inside. And the guy comes up behind him and says, I don't know why they call me the slice and dice killer. I much prefer using saws. Chainsaws, that is. And he revs up the chainsaw, and there you go. A kid gets cut up with a chainsaw. That's really the only story in the book that kind of has a grisly ending. It's not described, obviously. It's cut off before anything can happen. Cut off. Get it? I can't say anything about these because I haven't read them yet, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the story is like. It is basically scary stories for sleepovers, but there's a little slight mystery angle in some of the stories. Otherwise, it's totally the same. All right, back to the library. And then the last Scary Stories for Sleepovers branded book that I have that I know about is Scary Origami. Yes, they even did an origami book. This has no scary stories. It literally is just a craft book, but in true Scary Stories for Sleepovers fashion, it does have beautiful illustrations showing you exactly what you need your origami to look like. I love this headless corpse right here. That's a good one. I've read through this a little bit, and the steps are actually very, very helpful. I suck at origami. I'm really bad at it. I remember once a couple years ago at the library during the summer reading program, I needed to make a video for the library about their summer reading origami craft. They came to me because I'm good with making videos, but they did not factor in that I am terrible at origami. It took me forever to get that video done, guys. I had to bring in help. They had to show me how to do it. It turns out that the instructions just weren't the best, but the instructions in this book are actually really well written. They're very easy to follow. I could probably make the origami in this book. Maybe we'll try that around Halloween time. That could be a fun video, especially if I'm totally unable to do it and I get frustrated. I tend to swear a lot when I get frustrated, so that's fun. Anyway, Scary Origami, written by Jill Smolinski. There's that. But guys, there are so many other Scary Stories books that this publisher was pumping out at the time. And my goal is to read a bunch of these and talk about them in a video very, very soon, but totally separate from this one because I consider Scary Stories for Sleepovers to be its own entity, its own series. I don't really consider all of these other books to be spin-offs of it. I just consider them to be responses to the success of Scary Stories for Sleepovers, because Scary Stories for Sleepovers was a mega hit. There were millions of those books in print. It was a huge deal for Price Stern Sloan, so they were really trying to milk it for all it's worth, and I'm glad they did because it's left me with even more books to go out and discover. So stay tuned, creeps. There are a lot of other scary stories to talk about, as well as just scary books in general. I mean, these are all children's horror books behind me. I'm always getting comments from you guys saying, have you heard of this series or this series? Yes. It's back here on these shelves. I don't have everything, but aside from being a reader, I'm a huge collector, and I have amassed a huge library that just wraps around this entire room. I've got books all over the house. My entire house is a library. One day we'll do a full tour once I can get everything organized, but until then, I'm gonna keep talking about scary books, and I hope you join me for the ride. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to give me a comment down below telling me your memories about Scary Stories for Sleepovers. If you read these at all, maybe I'm the only one who has read these. I hope you creeps enjoyed the video, and I will see you very, very soon for another Later Creeps.